Hello wrestling fans. It's me, Pro Wrestle Machine, back reading from the January 9, 1995 Wrestling Observer newsletter. Flash report from Tokyo Dome. Looking back at 1994. UFC 5 date announced. Hogan vs. Vader preview. Tons more by Observer staff. Flash report from Tokyo Dome. January 4, 1. Shinjiro Otani retained the UWA Junior Heavyweight title, pinning El Samurai with a Dragon Suplex, full Nelson into German Suplex, in 15-17, 2. Norio Onega retained the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title, pinning Great Sasuke in 1439 with La Magistral, Dandy or Heavy Metal Cradle, 3. Akitoshi Saito and Kunyaki Kobayashi in Great Kabuki over Akira Nagami and Takayuki Iizuka and Osamu Kido in 1312 when Kabuki pinned Nagami with a clothesline, 4. Koji Kanemoto returned from the United States and pinned Yuji Nagata in 1443 with a senton backsplash off the top rope, 5. Hiroyoshi Yamamoto returned after a lengthy stay in Europe and pinned Manabu Nakanishi with his finishing maneuver called a mountain bomb, airplane spin dropped into a power bomb, in 740, 6. Tiger Jeet Singh Sr. and Jr. defeated Shiro Koshinaka and Michiyoshi Ohara in 1123 when Singh Sr. used the Cobra Claw on Ohara, 7. In the first round of the BVD martial arts tournament, Sting made American kickboxer Tony Palmore submit to the Scorpion in 429, 8. In the other tournament semi-final, Antonio Inoki defeated Gerard Gordeau, UFCI finalist, the famous karate/savate master from Holland with a choke sleeper in 637, 9. Riki Choshu and Yoshiaki Yatsu over Kengo Kimura and Tatsutoshi Goto in 1232 when Choshu pinned Kimura after a lariat, 10. Sabu and Masachono over Junji Hirata and Tatsumi Fujinami in 1118. Sabu hit Hirata with a chair and Chono scored the pin after a Yakuza kick, 11. Road Warrior Hawk, with Animal in his corner, pinned Scott Norton in 741 when Animal tripped up Norton from the outside and Hawk came off the top rope with a clothesline to the back for the pin, 12. In the BVD final, Inoki defeated Sting with a choke sleeper after getting behind him when Sting picked him up for a suplex in 10:26, 13. Hiroshi Hazi and Keiji Muto retained the IWGP Tag Team titles, beating Rick and Scott Steiner in 25-12 when Hazi pinned Scott after a Northern Lights suplex, 14. Shinya Hashimoto retained the IWGP Heavyweight title, pinning Kensuke Sasaki in 1936 with a Fisherman's Buster, Fisherman's Suplex drop straight down. We'll have more details next week. The show, billed as Battle 7, because it was New Japan's 7th annual Tokyo Dome show, drew a legit sellout 62,500, which makes it the 8th largest recorded crowd for pro wrestling of all time. It was the 4th largest of the 7 Dome shows. It was very rainy, which some thought might hurt the walk-up since it didn't sell out in advance as previous Dome shows have. As a Dome show, this was considered ordinary or even less than that as far as lineup was concerned, with the crowd being drawn largely because it is the traditional biggest show of the year in Japan, and not because of any specific matchup. There were no huge surprises other than fans probably expected several title changes, probably in all 3 IWGP title matches, and there weren't any. As is tradition, the Steiners match with Hazi and Muto was considered the best match on the show and Hawk Norton as the lone horrible match. Hashimoto Sasaki was also considered good, but no matches were talked of as being matches of the year. There were no unique suicidal moves by either Sabu or Great Sasuke. Of course, Antonio Inoki got the biggest reaction, followed by Hashimoto and Sasaki. Sting carried the Inoki match the entire way, with Inoki selling a bad leg coming down the aisle at the beginning from all the kicks by Gordeau in his first round match. Sting worked on the leg most of the match using the Scorpion and even the STF. There were a lot of hints throughout the show that this would be Inoki's final match in Japan, although it was never outright said. Sasuke was slowed by a broken wrist. For all his heart, this guy, if he doesn't tone down, is going to have his body fall completely apart by the end of this year. Suffered in mid-December but still did 2 Asai moonsaults into the aisle as the highlight of his match. Hiroyoshi Tenzan surprised a lot of people, showing up weighing in the 280 range. He was junior heavyweight size when he left, and got a nice reaction when he did a moonsault at that weight. On the United States wrestling scene, the year 1994 will be remembered for several huge stories. Vince McMahon, the most powerful wrestling promoter in the United States, spent 3 weeks on trial on steroid distribution and conspiracy charges before he was ultimately acquitted after nearly 17 hours of deliberation. Hulk Hogan, the leading drawing card for the previous 12 years, having already quit the WWF that made him into the most famous wrestler in the country since Gorgeous George joined WCW. Ric Flair, the greatest performer of the modern era, was forced into a retirement in hopes of garnering a strong buy rate that didn't materialize, that he insisted would be permanent, although it is a virtual lock that isn't the case. Pay-per-view, the most important and most lucrative revenue stream in the business, which had been championed by the WWF within this industry since its inception, found strong competition on two fronts to the point where many believe 1995 will be the year it loses its so-called crown. Despite untold amounts of talk over the years by promoters who would be kings, 1994 was the year that some new faces emerged from the rubble. The business changed greatly. Who would have believed on January 1, 1994, despite WCW coming off a strong Starrcade, that within 6 months their pay-per-view buy rates would challenge those of WWF? That the lead heel at the next Starrcade would be the one-time Brutus the Barber Beefcake? That WCW would ask Ric Flair to retire? That Bodyguard Diesel, as a babyface, would hold the WWF title and Bob Backlund, as a heel, would also hold the title and be his Christmas weekend house show foe as the main match in the traditional holiday weekend house shows? That Mr. T would wrestle at Starrcade and nobody would care? That a Hogan vs. Flair career match would be done with only a few weeks of television build-up? That Jim Ross would be fired twice by Vince McMahon as an announcer, only to finish the year as his key assistant in booking the WWF? That the guy who is quickly becoming the hottest drawing card on pay-per-view would be a 180-pound Brazilian who never appeared on television, and whose match outcomes weren't predetermined? That Pat Patterson would say under oath no less, that he'd never even heard of the word steroids until the late 1980s? That the best pay-per-view of the year would be produced by WCW, but would be headlined by Perro Aguayo? That Lex Luger would not only not win the WWF title, but fall to number 5 babyface in the promotion by year's end? That WCW could do a 1.0 buy rate on a pay-per-view and have it be a money loser? That Undertaker would die, and be resurrected, but that when he came back his drawing power would be nearly dead? That except for pay-per-view shows, the biggest drawing house shows for the WWF would be headlined by Jacques Rougeau? That the hottest wrestler in a promotion that prides itself on its hardcore audience would be the former Al Sledgehammer McGill? That Vince McMahon would be acquitted of all charges, and steroid use wouldn't once again become plentiful in the WWF? That Jesse Ventura's stock as an announcer would drop so greatly that WCW decided to send him his huge paycheck and ask he'd only do one thing for them: stay home? That WCW would promote a Hogan vs. Flair career match, but they would also be promoting a show 2 weeks later headlined by Perro Aguayo that would draw a bigger house? That the booker in Puerto Rico would be Dutch Mantel? That Jerry Lawler would come out of his statutory rape case almost unscathed marketability-wise, but be dead as a drawing card in Memphis for reasons having nothing to do with that? That WCW would decide to have Steve Austin put Jim Duggan over on a pay-per-view show in 30 seconds? That Roddy Piper would return, and when it was over, nobody would care, and 6 months later nobody would remember? That someone would win Heel of the Year and Tag Team of the Year by a landslide, and not live to hear out about it? That after Starrcade 93, Ric Flair would decide once again to turn himself heel? That Missy Hyatt would file a lawsuit against WCW for sexual harassment? That Dusty Rhodes would come out of retirement with one of the 2 or 3 best interviews of the year, and it would die at the box office throughout Florida and Georgia? That within the space of 1 year, Vince McMahon's personal Mel Cooley, Howard Finkel, who for all the negatives nearly everyone in wrestling says about him was still the best ring announcer in the business, would be written up in New York newspapers and be part of a feature story on a current affair for having given his blood for an HIV test under the name Terry Bollea, march around as a surrogate bushwhacker, and then be replaced as a ring announcer on television because he wasn't part of the new generation? That WCW would use Terry Funk and Jimmy Golden as a tag team and push Golden as the star of the team and barely let Funk talk on interviews? That an elected official on a WWF pay-per-view show would say how his favorite wrestler was Hulk Hogan, and a WWF announcer holding the mic would nearly pee in his pants, and the line would be edited off the replay show? That Hulk Hogan would get his good friend Randy Savage a job with WCW? That Shane Douglas would be a leading contender for the Best on Interviews award? That Vince McMahon would not only acknowledge WCW as his competition, but become almost obsessive about knocking them? That Hulk Hogan would, under oath, say that Vince McMahon was one of his best friends, and McMahon would spend the rest of the year telling any media who would listen that Hulk Hogan today was like Babe Ruth when he was a shell of himself at the end of his career with the Boston Braves? That a pay-per-view show taking place in Los Angeles would be referred to as coming from south of the border? Or that Hogan would come to WCW and refuse to put Flair over? Okay, you all would have believed that one. And that was all only in the United States. That's why any attempts at predicting what will happen in 1995 seem silly. But one thing looks certain. This year will bring more major changes in the industry. UFC V was officially announced as going to take place on April 7 in Wichita, Kansas. The attempts to move the date up to March were unsuccessful, although the plan is to run 4 pay-per-view events in 1995. The format will be, as already stated here, a main event with Royce Gracie plus a tournament underneath. Gracie's opponent is expected to be finalized sometime this week. We were told the decision has been narrowed to either Dennis Alexio, a world champion kickboxer from Hawaii, or pro wrestlers Dan Severn and Ken Wayne Shamrock. My feeling is if they could get Alexio for the same price, he'd have the inside track, even though he'd probably have the least chance of the 3 in a match because they believe he'd have the most marketability. Alexio's asking price appears to be much higher than the other 2, which makes him somewhat of a long shot. Chemo was dropped from consideration for this specific show because of the proximity of the show to his already signed March 3 kickboxing match in Japan, and they didn't want to get into a major promotional campaign which would be starting fairly soon with one of the main eventers, and have to start the promotion anew if with a few weeks left if he were to be injured. Bob Shamrock, the father and manager of Ken Shamrock, was still pushing for the match despite his son holding the Pancrase version of the World Heavyweight title, which shows a lot of guts on their part since pro wrestling organizations traditionally don't want their world champions put in a position of losing since it hurts the credibility, at least organizations where credibility is considered a factor, of which Pancrase is one of the title claim. It now appears that the total refunds that will have to be given based on the finish of the Gracie-Severn match being cut off in 30% of the country is about 5 to 10%, $90,000 to $180,000 of gross revenue. Most people who complained were given either free replay showings and/or UFC merchandise to soothe their fury. At one point right after the show there was fear that refunds could total as much as the full 30%, which would have been in excess of $500,000. After being scared with that figure, whatever it actually costs is probably a relief. One of the unanswered questions is how that 30% of the audience will respond as far as buying the next show. In addition, the next show comes 5 days after WrestleMania. WrestleMania is the one show that no matter how things evolve over the next 4 months and what matches are on each show, would by name alone and history probably survive almost totally unscathed of having a UFC show 5 days later in regard to direct competition. Although the situations are altogether different, the upcoming Hulk Hogan vs. Vader matches, which start at Super Brawl on February 19th in Baltimore at this point, pose the same situation in regard to a world champion doing a job in another organization, as Shamrock would in a match with Gracie. With Vader holding the UWFI version of the title and UWFI very much into its title being credible as a real, or even a real world heavyweight wrestling champion, the organization would no doubt have serious problems with Vader doing a clean job for Hogan of all people. I'm also relatively certain that in the first few matches, rematches are already set for February 24th to 25th-26 at a house show run in Milwaukee, Chicago and Detroit. They won't do a finish unless Hogan does the first job, which would probably be the best thing for the feud business-wise, but even suggesting seems like a broken record. But the end result of the feud everyone knows. Vader has a UWFI title defense on January 16th against Gary Albright. Given that Vader submitted to Albright in a tag match in October and that Vader is more of a drawing card than Albright, that it would, everything else being thrown out, time to return the favor. However, since UWFI and WCW have no business relationship, it wouldn't come as a surprise to see Albright win just for the title's self-preservation, since there is no question at some point WCW will pressure Vader to put Hogan over. Hogan Vader handled correctly should do good business, and there are many ways to involve both Flair and Savage into the mix to keep it fresh and drawing for an easy 6 to 9 months. As far as match quality goes, Vader's best matches are always with opponents who don't mind getting pounded on for the sake of having a good match. So it's really up to Hogan, or maybe Savage if he's worked into a tag mix. The idea of Hogan and Savage or Sting versus Flair and Vader sounds good on paper. Vader never looks good when he has to work light, but if you were in Hogan's shoes and you were in the driver's seat when it comes to the decision-making, you may choose to have the bad match. After the match with Butcher, even the bad match with Vader is a decided improvement. When you throw Flair or Sting into the mix, you can get both a good marquee value and the good performance, provided Flair, who will be 46 when he comes back, hasn't lost his edge in both categories since he didn't exactly go out on a stellar note to the fans, although he did as a worker. The momentum UFC takes into 1995 makes its growth one of the biggest, if not the biggest, story to watch as it involves this industry. Within wrestling, I've gathered there are different schools of thought in regard to UFC. One school of thought are those who believe the current lows in TV ratings and attendance can be traced to the lack of seriousness, intensity and believability of the product. Believe as UFC gets more popular, pro wrestling will suffer because the style looks more serious, and it will expose what real fighting looks like to the public. In addition, it is something new at a time pro wrestling seems to be in a desperate search for something new but only succeeding in poor attempts to recreate the past. Another school of thought is that UFC is a fad that will either quickly die out due to a lack of sustained interest or through governmental regulations banning the events. Yet a third school of thought is the totally oblivious school pretending it isn't there, although considering Titan's actions in taking one of its new characters as a direct ripoff, and WCW's in at one point attempting to get one of its wrestlers entered in UFC, shows neither group is really ignorant of what is going on here, and since they also know the buy rates, they have to be concerned. One of the advantages of following wrestling worldwide, and in particular wrestling in Japan, is that in most, but not all cases, if you follow Japan, you see what the trends are and problems that will face wrestling in the United States 5 to 10 years earlier than it hits the United States. This is a perfect case in point. Although there are several differences, some of which are major, a lot of this situation is similar to 1988-89 Japan and the incredible success of the old UWF. For those who weren't following the scene at that time, in 1987, Akira Maeda, who was one of the top stars with New Japan, was suspended for taking a cheap shot in a match, and rather than take the punishment, got backers and pulled several of his protégés and friends from New Japan and reformed the second UWF, a more realistic-looking but still with predetermined finishes form of pro wrestling. The original UWF, 1984-85, had a cult following in Tokyo with a stronger, stiffer style of work, although because the public wasn't quite ready for what they were doing and a lack of television to sell the public on it, the group couldn't draw well outside Tokyo, and a lot of fans really didn't understand what they were seeing because it looked so different from the pro wrestling they were used to. After the first UWF folded, Maeda and several others, including today's hot draw Nobuhiko Takada, joined New Japan, and with their style being exposed on network primetime television each week, the casual audience started understanding that their knee locks, arm bars, chicken wings, Achilles tendon holds, half crabs and short arm scissors were finishing submission maneuvers. By just being there and being top stars within New Japan, it also put these so-called realistic maneuverings into the style of the New Japan wrestlers and has since become part of Japanese style across all promotions since all the younger wrestlers of today grew up watching it on television in 1986 through 87. When Maeda formed the second UWF in 1988, this time the public was on the same page and ready. UWF was the hottest promotion in the world for a few years, climaxing by selling out a Tokyo Dome show, 60,000 tickets sold in 3 days, in record time for a show on November 29, 1989. Eventually the organization disintegrated due to major front office problems, and splintered into different groups that have today evolved into Maeda's Rings, which still draws well but has totally lost its fire, Takada's UWFI, which is the most popular right now, and Pancrase, which is actually the most realistic looking and seems to have a significant cult following since it drew more than 11,000 fans 2 consecutive nights at Tokyo Sumo Hall 3 weeks ago. Of the 3 successors to the original UWF, Pancrase, which is the most extreme when it comes to a realistic-looking style, is the closest to UFC, and there have been a number of athletes crossover from one to the other, most notable of which is Shamrock. If wrestling people have reason to be concerned about UFC, and they should at least be concerned, martial arts businessmen need to be positively scared to death. UFC exposes what is done in pro wrestling as a work. Big deal. Everyone knew that to begin with. But it also exposes karate and taekwondo in street fighting situations. This exposes exactly what their businesses are being built around to not be the case. Because of that, within the martial arts world, there are numerous people who hate the Gracies for purely business reasons and some for personal reasons as well. They would love to be able to say UFCs, which are the very public affirmation of the Gracie style being superior to better known and more lucrative martial arts businesses, have predetermined endings and that Royce Gracie's victories are frauds. In a sense, that's a gigantic difference between UFC and a UWF derivative in Japan. But from a wrestling fan and business perspective, it isn't as big a difference since it appears most fans in Japan believe in Pancrase and the lures of a UWFI or a Pancrase at least enough to believe, and the drama of the deadly submission holds in UFC is identical in regard to both its drawing mystique and its effect on what we'd call traditional pro wrestling. When UWF got hot, and even in the 1984-85 period when it only had a cult following, there were many in the traditional pro wrestling world who thought it was the worst thing to happen to pro wrestling. UWF wrestlers openly said what they did was real and that pro wrestling was fake, and they were all and as it turned out future, pro wrestling stars. And while that in many ways made them the biggest hypocrites of all, the fact is, traditional pro wrestling in Japan is still more than alive and well. And UWF-style pro wrestling is also both more than alive and well. Both styles coexist, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. In fact, by introducing more realism and submissions and getting the style over to the public, it allowed All Japan and New Japan to do more realistic-looking matches that fans would pop for because they were more educated. In a sense, instead of exposing or hampering pro wrestling, They enhanced it and paved the way for the current boom in attendance, which is directly due to a more serious and more athletic-like ring style and finishes. Switch 6 years later to the United States. There are very key differences. UFC has no television, let alone weekly network prime time like Maeda was on with New Japan to get new submission moves over. There are no famous wrestlers, and certainly no Maedas, that had name recognition going into pro wrestling fans, as the top drawing card for UFC. With predetermined endings, Maeda could book himself as the Ultimate Fighter, which was great since he had name recognition and great popularity going in, was a good athlete, and was Japanese. Royce Gracie had no real name recognition outside some small circles of martial arts 1 year ago, and most importantly in a country that is still more drawn to size, power and nationalism. Gracie, no matter who he beats and how often, will never be huge, will never look imposing, and will never be accepted as an American. UWF never was a shoot, except perhaps in occasional undercard matches. American pro wrestling was much farther from realism than Japanese style to begin with, so adapting more realistic moves that get over in another form to enhance the style will look even more foreign. Most importantly, pro wrestling isn't as popular right now to begin with. Although in 1988, the period when UWF changed the Japanese scene, pro wrestling was considered in a lull when it came to popularity. The reason UFC caught on in the United States while UWFI didn't in the United States is not the real versus fake issue, but somewhat better marketing and more because when Americans think of a fight, they think of the punch in martial arts, largely because of movies and the popularity of boxing. So even though UFCs have downplayed punches to not be as important as wrestling and submissions, by seeing the punches and having bare-knuckle punches and martial arts kicks legal, that is the primary violent draw. The Japanese, on the other hand, don't think of a punch. They think of wrestling, martial arts and submission moves, because of pro wrestling's popularity for years on television and martial arts movies. UWFI, which doesn't include punches to the head, is tailored to the Japanese mentality. The punch to the head is still the most over move in a UFC to fans. The open hand blows to the head hurt the excitement to an American fan at home who has seen boxing his entire life, whereas to someone in Japan, that's not a factor. So that's the difference between Japan 1988 and United States 1995. The similarities are more obvious. Pro wrestling at a lull. The important matches have unrealistic and predictable screw job finishes. A new group that, if not real, certainly looks real enough or more real than anything seen before, gains exposure and catches fire. UFC hasn't caught fire like UWF did 7 years ago, but it was starting from absolute zero, whereas UWF started with built-in popularity based on the names of Maeda, Takada, Fujiwara and others. But on pay-per-view it already rivals the two major groups and has more momentum than either. UFC could also burn out as a fad, be banned by this time next year, or lose its edge because of the expected plethora of worked imitators that will surely spring up based on its success. There is also both AAA and ECW to consider as far as shaping the future of wrestling. Both are limited in potential for obvious reasons, but that isn't saying they couldn't either or both be successful. The key is exposure, and worrying about strengths and weaknesses of the products as arguments really means nothing until the groups first get the necessary exposure to allow them to compete on a major scale. Japan already has its own group within AAA-type modern-day lucha libre combined with Japanese-style, Michinoku Pro, that has a cult following promoting in small towns in rural northeastern Japan. It has made enough of an impact this past year that its top wrestler was named Wrestler of the Year by Weekly Pro last week. Most of the signs are that the group may be artistically successful. It is not financially successful, although it is far more successful than its U.S. regional counterpart SMW. It has several ECWs, the two most prominent being FMW, which is exceedingly successful, and EVA, which shows signs of some popularity. Although AAA has far more potential, as has already been shown as an ethnic draw with eventual crossover, it doesn't appear to have the organization either here or in Mexico that is going to make it happen. It came off a pay-per-view with great momentum and has largely squandered it. ECW's future depends on first getting exposure strong enough to run pay-per-view off it, then being successful on pay-per-view. Without those two steps, they may gain a lot of notoriety among some fans, but they really won't be a factor as major players in 1995. End result of history. Traditional pro wrestling 5 years after the UWF exploded was more successful than ever before in Japan. UWF style was also successful. But it wasn't that simple as just ignoring the new fad, doing the same thing you've always done, being patient, and prospering. In fact, All Japan and New Japan, the big two, made their own product more realistic. All Japan, the most conservative company in the world, reacted strongly to the change in the business. They dropped blading completely and eliminated all screw job finishes. They focused more of the work on submissions and very stiff work, while maintaining some of the high-flying spots. The elimination of the screw jobs is probably the biggest change from the traditional DQ and double count-out finishes in the top matches of years past, and the one that should be most credited to the increase in attendance, although they also gained a reputation as having the best main event matches in the world, which didn't hurt as far as drawing fans to the arenas. What UWF, in giving people either knockouts or submission finishes every time out, did, is make fans no longer accept anything but a clean ending. All Japan's matches weren't made realistic like a UWFI style, but were more realistic than any pro wrestling style in years. While its popularity increased greatly at live events, there is a downside to this as well. While this style seems to attract fans to buildings, what happened at the other end was similar to 1987 New Japan. Maeda in key matches was a big ticket seller, but since his matches were unspectacular to the casual fan, TV ratings dropped and eventually New Japan lost prime time, although judging from how New Japan's business went since that time, it's far better off the way it is now. All Japan also saw a ratings drop, although most feel that was due to having the same matches over and over, which is also a negative byproduct of what they were doing. The stronger the style, the harder it is to find wrestlers who can be put on top and execute the style. A weak athletic style like a WWF style can be done by nearly anyone with a little bit of experience in the ring and a nice-looking costume. Anyone but a top worker in All Japan immediately stands out like a sore thumb. Ted DiBiase, when he went back, was a top worker and stood out like a sore thumb, which showed just how difficult the style really had become. Eventually they were moved to an horrendous time slot, and the combination of the same talent and same matches and weak television did take an edge off All Japan this year, although not in Tokyo where it has sold out every event for years. While New Japan didn't go quite as far as All Japan when it comes to all clean finishes, although I can only recall out of more than 100 house shows, 4 matches that didn't have clean finishes all year, and total elimination of the blade, they largely followed suit. They even took sports realism one step farther, to eliminating the so-called traditional ladder of success in Japan. Instead of focusing on one wrestler and having rigid positioning of talent, they had a system where any of the top wrestlers could beat any other, and upsets happened frequently. The top matches were intriguing because the fans knew there would be a pin at the end, and also didn't know for certain who would win or what move they'd win with. My feeling is that WWF will be the most adaptive to change in 1995. It has to be. Unlike in WCW, the money WWF loses comes right out of Vince McMahon's pocketbook, so money losses aren't just fun and games to him as they are with the people running WCW. He's obviously very serious about his bottom line, and it must also be a precarious bottom line these days, as exemplified by no revenge and no major raids in the other direction. It will be very difficult for a WWF so weaned on never doing finishes where top babyfaces lose clean, to break from the pattern. It'll be even more difficult to fans weaned on never seeing their heroes lose clean to accept those changes if they are made. All the rumors of WWF going to a Japanese-like system in 1995 with more parity on type and clean finishes means the top faces are going to have to do jobs or the system won't work. But for a Japanese system to work means WWF would have to greatly improve its house show work rate and quality of its crew overall. The United States as it stands now doesn't have the grassroots system of Japan or Mexico when it comes to creating new stars and giving them the necessary fundamental background. Instead, as WCW showed with Alex Wright and Jean-Paul Levesque on the last pay-per-view, promotions are so desperate to create new stars that they are pushing people well before they are ready, and it shows on the big cards. WCW won't change in 1995. Hogan is in charge. Hogan only knows 1980s American style. Ric Flair only knows it as well. In the Hogan 1980s American world, the top faces is Superman and not athlete, and he doesn't lose clean. The top heel never wins clean. Where's the heat if the heel wins without cheating? Only problem is in 1994, no company with that attitude made a profit. I swear I'm not making any of this up. Oliver James Tengen, 49, the former pro wrestling champion of Zimbabwe who was one of the country's most popular babyface wrestling as the Black Panther from 1960 to 1985, committed suicide in a church on December 27. His suicide came after he confessed to murdering his girlfriend and her sister the night before. Police say OJ burst into their home and attacked everyone in sight, accusing his girlfriend and her relatives of loving him only for his money. Last year he was cleared of murder charges in the death of his wife, who died from having her food poisoned. Because next week's issue will be the Year in Review 24-page awards double issue, if you've got A1 on your address label, it means your Observer subscription expires in 1 week. Renewal rates within the United States, Canada, and Mexico remain $8 for 4 issues, $15 for 8, $22 for 12, $28 for 16, $42 for 24, $56 for 32 up through $70 for 40 issues. Rates for the rest of the world for weekly airmail delivery are $11 for 4, $21 for 8, $30 for 12. All subscription renewals along with reports from live shows, letters to the editor, news items, and any other correspondence pertaining to this newsletter should be sent to the Wrestling Observer Newsletter, P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 950091228. Fax messages can be sent afternoon Eastern Time on a daily basis to 408-378-6562. Phone messages can be left 24 hours a day at 408-379-8067. For the most up-to-date wrestling news, I can be reached every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at the Real Wrestling Hotline at 900-903-9030 for 99 cents per minute. We also do 1-hour post-show discussions on the hotline starting approximately 15 minutes after the completion of every pay-per-view show. UWA. Sato, Shiryu and Masato Yakashiji from Michinoku Pro are headed in since Michinoku Pro won't be running much due to winter snow blocking the roads in the northeastern part of the Japan, which is their base. Also in is Parata Morgan from MLL. Morgan had been disciplined so often with MLL over no-shows that he quit the office and came here. Both Kanek and Negro Navarro have talked publicly of retiring because business is so bad. Both said they would give it another year before making the decision. EMLL. The final at Arena Mexico on December 16 saw Silver King and El Texano capture the vacant CMLL tag team titles, beating Emilio Charles Jr. and El Satanico in the tourney finale. It was said to have been a good fast-paced match. The other key main event saw La Fiera beat Black Magic in a hair versus hair, which wasn't that good. The final moments of both matches aired on Galavision over the weekend, and they both had a lot of heat. Mil Mascaras returned for the undercard and didn't do much but got a nice reaction since he's a legend. Mascaras worked a few shows around Mexico City, but it didn't help the crowds any, although he got strong reactions. In a suburban show in Naucalpan where he teamed with Silver King and Texano, the newspaper snidely remarked that, since Negro Casas was on the heel side against them, that Mascaras watched a great match. Pantera and Felino are starting a feud at Arena Coliseo on Tuesdays. Javier Cruz beat Cesar Dantes in a hair versus hair on December 25 in Guadalajara. Negro Casas and Hector Garza won the tag team tournament on December 30 at Arena Coliseo, billed as the great alternative in which established stars would team with up-and-comers. In the finals they beat Arcangel de la Muerte and Satanico. Casas was pinned first, leaving Garza against both, and he made Arcangel submit to the camel clutch and Satanico submit to the torture rack, which apparently sets Garza up as a contender for Satanico's middleweight strap. Newspapers reported the wrestling as being very good but the crowd as being poor. Major show this week is January 6 at Arena Coliseo, which goes head-to-head with Triple A at Juan de la Barrera, with the Satanico vs. Garza title match as the headliner, plus Atlantis and Negro Casas, and Mascara Magica vs. Emilio Charles Jr. and Dr. Wagner Jr. and Arcangel de la Muerte. Sable and Ruben Juarez Jr. are headed in and expect major pushes for some new wrestlers in the next few months. Ultimo Dragon had arthroscopic knee surgery. Woman wrestler Zulima will spend all of 1995 working for All Japan Women. A wrestler named American Machine debuted on December 29 as a babyface main eventer. No idea who it is. Despite numerous reports to the contrary, Art Barr never used the name American Love Machine in Mexico. He was only known as Love Machine. He was called American Love Machine in the Northwest and American Machine in Japan. Box y Lucha, considered the Bible of Mexican wrestling, named Dos Caras as best babyface, Charles Jr., Conan and Parada Morgan as best heels, Death Missionaries as best trio, Hector and Humberto Garza as best tag team, Flor Metallica as best woman wrestler, Atlantico and Ludwig Starr as best rookies, Saigoncito Dragon as best mini. He really is very good, although he's no Espectrito or Octagonchito, and Corazon de Leon and Love Machine best foreigners. How they came to some of these conclusions is anyone's guess. Japan. The first show of the new year was All Japan show on January 2 at Korakuen Hall, with the annual Battle Royal on top, which was won by Steve Williams when he pinned Mitsuharu Misawa after 3 backdrops. It appears Dan Crawford and Doug Furness are getting a push to the next level as they defeated Stan Hansen and Johnny Smith. In the first of the round-robin matches for the Asian tag title, Ryukaku Izumida and Tamon Honda upset the Fantastics and Tommy Dreamer, who will be getting a push later in the tour as Hansen's tag team partner, debuted in the opener beating Mighty Inoue. The 6-man main event saw Yoshinari Ogawa and Akira Tao and Toshiaki Kawada over Misawa and Jun Akiyama and Satoru Asako when Kawada beat Akiyama in 21:01. The only news we've gotten about the Eva's opening night show at Korakuen Hall on January 2nd is that in the barbed wire match, Terry Funk and Shoji Nakamaki beat Tracy Smothers and Cactus Jack, before a packed house. At some point a chair was lit on fire and used as a weapon, probably on Nakamaki. Yoji Angio did a press conference talking about the incident with Rickson Gracie. Angio claimed he wasn't at 100% although gave no specific reason as to why and said he wanted another chance at Gracie. Now you have to understand that Japanese reporters as a rule in general aren't confrontational types and wrestling reporters are no different. So when one of the daily sports reporters got confrontational it was out of character so to speak. Apparently the reporter said to Angio that he broke into the guy's dojo and his people caused a scene, then he lost and now he says he wasn't 100% anyway. Angio, who got really sad when confronted, was there to say he wanted another match with Gracie at a neutral site. The two schools of thought are this: if they really do meet again, it means Gracie is doing business with UWFI and the original escapade was likely an angle. If they don't, this press conference was simply a way for Angio to save face after a very public story of his humiliation. Gong magazine named Jushin Liger the 1994 Pro Wrestling MVP. Liger got the award for his work in popularizing the junior heavyweight division, particularly in organizing the Super J Cup show and in opening up business with Michinoku Pro, which led to some of the more memorable matches of the year. Steve Williams vs. Kenta Kobashi from Budokan Hall was named Match of the Year, while once again Genichiro Tenryu and Ashura Hara vs. Atsushi Onita and Tarzan Goto was named Tag Match of the Year. Kayota Shinya Hashimoto, Great Sasuke, Shinjiro Otani and Akira Hokuto received the other awards but won't have translations for who got what until next week. USWA. Brian Christopher regained the USWA title from Tommy Rich on the live December 31st television show. The finish saw Scott Bowden get on the apron as Christopher had Rich pinned and Christopher went after him. As ref Kevin Christian, Kevin Lawler, Brian's younger brother, although this isn't acknowledged in the storyline, got between the two, Rich pulled out a chain and KO'd Christopher. When Christian turned around with Rich on top, he heard the fans screaming and started arguing with Rich about fans saying he used a chain. Rich got up to argue with Christian and Christopher then pulled out a chain and used it and got the pin. After the match Rich called Christian out and told him to ask the fans if Christopher used a chain and Christian said the decision was final. Rich then told him if he wouldn't ask the fans, to go back and watch the finish on a replay and Kevin said he wouldn't and Rich decked him. Rich and Bowden attacked both Christian and Booker Randy Hales until Eddie Marlin came out and did the threatening to suspend them routine. Business has been up the past 2 weeks as the December 26th house show, largely due to it being Christmas week and the return of Jimmy Valiant since the card was basically the same as it was the previous 2 weeks that drew about half as many, was up to 1,800 fans and $10,600. On to the crowd was estimated at another 1,500 with nothing special on the show headlined by Sid Vicious vs. Christopher for the unified title which ended with Vicious hitting the ref for the DQ. They had an undercard match in which the losing team would have to split up where Moondogs beat Beauty and the Beast, Jim and Ron Harris. Apparently not only will Ron Harris with Brother Don get another chance with Titan Sports, also being considered from here are Spellbinder and Miss Texas. In a funny skit, Bowden brought out a new masked protege called the Destroyer against jobber longtime jobber Ken Raper. Raper pinned Destroyer so after the match Rich and Bowden beat him up. Raper came back to make the save but he was beaten up by Rich as well. Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee formed a tag team on television for the first time since Dundee's latest return. SMW. They taped television through February 11th at the tapings on 2 in Sevierville, Tennessee. The show that airs January 14th opens with Cactus Jack and Boo Bradley together at a mental hospital showing Bradley getting a clean bill of health. They do an interview from after the Christmas night show from the dressing room after Jim Cornette had been beaten up by the Gangstas and D. Low Brown calling up the Heavenly Bodies. Cornette then did a live interview walking with a cane saying he wanted to bring the Bodies back for a match with the Gangstas and the Gangstas jumped him and kicked away his cane and started pounding on him until Bob and Steve Armstrong came out with baseball bats. Bob explained that when the police come to stop a crime, they don't ask if the victim was a jerk before jumping in to stop it. Bob then granted the Bodies reinstatement into SMW for the January 28th match in Knoxville. Jerry Lawler did another taped interview running down East Tennessee saying how everyone from Memphis laughs about how dumb everyone is in East Tennessee but are also embarrassed to be from the same state as them. Chris Condito did an interview saying how happy he was to smash Bradley's cat and they brought up that Tammy Fitch had been suspended for what happened to the cat. Eddie Gilbert then showed up unannounced doing a paranoia gimmick with Jim Ross asking what he's doing there because he doesn't even work for SMW. Gilbert ended up being mad because at the Night of the Legends they honored everyone but Tommy Gilbert, and how then even honored Paul Morton. It wound up with Ricky Morton coming out and the two had a match which Gilbert won with his feet on the ropes, which he calls the new Thez press. Gilbert then said he had a mystery partner and wanted a tag match next week with the Rollin' Rolls. On January 21 they announced Buddy Landel had received a timekeeper's license through his agent Robert Q. Harmon, and he'd be the timekeeper for the January 28 Dirty White Boy vs. Lawler title match. They had another video with Jack and Bradley as a spoof of the Hulk Hogan-Dave Sullivan angle. Jack gave Bradley his lucky tights which he wore when Vader tore his ear off and when he lost his teeth, and said he hoped it would give Bradley similar luck. Bradley then came out wearing his boxers over the tights for his match with Condito. After a ref bump, a bag lady came out and sprayed Bradley and Condito got the pin. Ref Mark Curtis revived and pulled the wig off the bag lady, revealing Fitch, and reversed the decision. After the match, Condito pulled out a can of dog food, really it was beef stew, and poured it all over Bradley, including down his mouth. Cornette then did a heavy racial interview on tape, which was the interview talked about last week that he did with the bodies from the WWF. Jim Ross even apologized for the interview beforehand. Gangstas then confronted Bob Armstrong about letting the bodies in and favoring the whites, and Armstrong went nuts and called them assholes, and the Gangstas claimed they'd take care of Armstrong. Steve Armstrong was then scheduled for a singles match with New Jack. New Jack came out with Mustafa and Brown, which brought out Cornette with an injunction saying they couldn't be at ringside. However, they beat up Cornette and then went after Steve and injured his knee with a billy club before the match even started. Bob ran in with a baseball bat to break it up. Rock and Rolls wrestled Gilbert and Unabomber, Glenn Jacobs / Doomsday from Puerto Rico, ending when Gibson was thrown over the top rope for a DQ. Unabomber and Gilbert are doing a Shawn Michaels / Diesel gimmick, and Unabomber not selling anything for Morton. The January 28 show saw Bob Armstrong open, announcing on February 25 they'd have a card called Brawl at the Hall in Johnson City, and that Sunday Bloody Sunday 2 would be on February 26 in Knoxville. They showed a tape after the previous week's New Jack Steve Armstrong match with ice on Steve's knee. They are saying Steve's knee is out and he's injured. Actually, Steve is injured, but it's fluid in his back suffered while wrestling at the tag team tournament in Japan. Bob Armstrong said since Cornette came out to help that he would grant Cornette one favor, but only one, and told Cornette to choose it wisely. Scott Armstrong and Tracy Smothers announced they were forming a tag team of the new Southern Boys to feud with Gangstas. I'm guessing the normal house shows will feature Southern Boys versus Gangstas, Rock and Rolls versus Gilbert and Unabomber. Condito does an interview talking about upcoming matches with Bradley where the loser has to eat dog food, which I presume will finish Condito off here before heading to WWF. Landel has a TV title defense against White Boy, winning by using brass knucks, which no doubt sets up SMW title defenses by White Boy at the house shows. They finish the show with the SMW Rumble Royal where Unabomber does the total Diesel gimmick, destroying one jobber after another. Finally, Morton, who drew the second to last name, comes in and can't hurt him with anything he does until he finally kicks him low. As Morton pounded on Unabomber, the last wrestler, Gilbert, came in and threw powder in Morton's eyes. Gilbert and Unabomber then split the winnings. The February 4 television show will be entirely composed of the January 28 Super Saturday Night Fever show, and apparently there will be several angles coming out of the show. On the February 11 show they announced that on February 25 the Gangstas and Brown face Smothers and Scott and Bob Armstrong, while on February 26 they face Bodies and Cornette. Gangstas attacked Bob with a billy club to the knee after Armstrong levied a fine against them, which set up the Johnson City six-man. Cornette asked Bob for a special referee on February 26 as his one favor, but they never say who it will be. During a Bradley squash, the Bag Lady and Condito come out. Bag Lady goes to spray Bradley, who ducks, and Condito gets it. Tammy runs away and Bradley dumps dog food all over Condito. Final match was Gibson vs. Unabomber, ending with the Bubba Rogers spot of Morton running out with a chair and cracking it over Unabomber's head, but he doesn't sell the blow. Continuing controversy about two recent angles. The angle where the cat gets killed will air on television this coming week. In addition, Cornette continues to do the racial remarks at the Gangstas as a babyface at the house shows. In the former, Joe Pedicino, who does wraparounds on the Atlanta station that airs SMW, made some kind of a remark suggesting the bag may not really have a cat in it, which got Cornette upset. Apparently at the last show in Marietta over Thanksgiving, Cornette had told Pedicino what he was planning for Christmas, and Pedicino, whose station that he does the wrestling block for is run by a Christian organization, got worried, particularly since the station already has expressed concern over other angles on the show, in particular when Buddy Landel said he felt like God Almighty when he put the plastic bag over White Boy's head. On that angle, as far as I'm concerned, since there was no real cat in the bag, so it's no different than the angle Jake Roberts and Earthquake did in WWF a few years ago. However, if they lose even one television station over the angle, then it is hardly worth it. But they shouldn't have that problem. I was told that the general feeling in Knoxville when the angle was done live is that most people didn't really believe a cat was in the bag anyway. As far as the racial remarks go, in Erlanger, Kentucky on December 29 there were a few blacks in the crowd when he made them, and I can just imagine how they felt when a main event babyface is making those remarks. On the weekend TV show when Jim Ross was talking about the NWA tournament that Condito won, he said that every reputable organization in the world sent a representative, calling Lawler the WWF rep, Eddie Gilbert the USWA rep, Lou Perez the Florida rep, and Evan Storm the Eastern rep, and Osamu Nishimura as the New Japan rep. ECW. Tully Blanchard is coming in to challenge Shane Douglas for the ECW title on January 7. They are trying to intimate that Blanchard is somehow another emissary of Ric Flair, pointing to them being tag team partners from years back. Besides the 3 vs 4 match already announced, also added to the show this past week is Pit Bulls vs Axel and Ian Rotten, with the losing team having to split up, and Mikey Whipwreck vs the Giant, 5-4, Paul Loria. On the angle talked about in the December 26th issue where Cactus Jack clocked Angel with the stick, it was actually Tommy Dreamer and not Cactus Jack who made the remark about busting the Virgin's cherry. Even ECW edited that off television. After being called Steve Flamingo last week, Steve Richards, doing a Scotty Flamingo imitation, this week was being called Stevie the Body, and I have a feeling next week he'll be Stevie Polo. The January 6th Hamburg, Pennsylvania show was cancelled. Here and there. Multi-channel news has corrected itself on the UWFI buy rate. It's now listing the buy rate as 0.12%, or about $175,000 in after split gross. The original 0.65 figure sounded ridiculous on the surface as we'd written. It would be probably the 4th lowest wrestling buy rate in history, trailing only the Herb Abrams pay-per-view, the LLPW show, and the second UWFI. Abdullah the Butcher has opened up a restaurant in the Atlanta area called Abdullah's House of Ribs and Chinese Food. Several AAA wrestlers have worked this past week in the Los Angeles area since AAA isn't running in Mexico. Psicosis, Rey Mysterio Jr., Super Muñeco and Torero were all in town working December 30th in Compton, California before 375 were in a main event trios match. Psicosis pinned Rey Mysterio in 2 straight falls to set up a match for Mysterio's IWC middleweight title on January 2nd in Huntington Park. That show drew only 120, with Mysterio retaining the title in a disappointing match. They return on January 21st with Octagon and Octagon Cheeto vs La Parca and La Parquita on top, plus Muñeco vs Bradley in a mask vs hair. At the December 30th show, Mercurio turned heel on Brother Piloto Suicida to start a feud which should highlight the Southern California indies. The Waynesboro News Virginian of all places ran an article on Scott Norton on December 27th, who was in town visiting family over the holidays. Norton claimed he was going to have a mixed match against George Foreman in South Korea and pretty well put over that the business in Japan was much stronger than in the United States, blaming it on Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan, neither of whom he mentioned by name. The top promoter and top box office draw both publicly came out and said wrestling was fake, that it's entertainment, and that hurt professional wrestling tremendously in the United States. In Japan, we get as close to real as you possibly can. When people pay as much as $350 for a ringside seat and stadiums from 8,000 to 80,000 are sold out night after night, you have to give them what they want. And I have plenty of bumps and bruises to show how physical it is. Norton said he's moving from Washington to Atlanta and hinted at joining WCW. While Hulk Hogan is always looking for new large monsters to feed himself, and size-wise Norton fits the bill. According to those who have worked with him in Japan, they say that Vader is a piece of cake to work when it comes to being a bruiser as compared with Norton. Jim Crockett ran every night from Christmas to New Year's. He drew about 700 on December 25th in Dallas and came back with 600 on January 1st. However, in between the crowds were in the 50 to 60 range with a high of about 100. Expect John Hawk to get a big push as they want to start pushing younger wrestlers. Kevin Von Erich vs. Greg Valentine for the latter's North American title in a rematch headlines January 7th. AAA. The biggest news is that a press conference was scheduled for January 4th in Mexico City, where it will be announced that Fuerza Guerrera and Raul Reyes, a former wrestler who runs several small arenas in Mexico City, are starting their own promotion. They are supposed to announce several names as part of the new promotion, with the names rumored to include Los Villanos, Gran Hamada, Scorpio Jr., Shu El Guerrero, Transformer and Cybernetico, which pretty much makes a clean sweep of what little talent was left in UWA with the exception of Connect and the Death Missionaries, along with Tinieblas Jr., El Santo Negro, formerly Espanto brought in as a heel Santo, and Mascara Sagrada. Actually, this is Antonio Pena's idea, since he's long been trying to do a promotion versus promotion feud, probably after seeing the Heat the New Japan versus Heisei Gun feud used to draw in Japan. He tried with AAA vs UWA last year, but it fell apart due to problems with certain wrestlers and office egos. So this time he's creating his own new Mexican promotion. What's really interesting is a match on January 8th in Mexico City has Fuerza and Juventud Guerrera defending the Mexican tag titles against Heavy Metal and Latin Lover in their mandatory title rematch. With Fuerza leaving, you'd think they'd lose the belts. Juventud looks to be staying to keep alive his feud with Rey Mysterio Jr., but Heavy and Latin have already split up and have been feuding. The first major show of the new year on January 6th at Wanda La Barrera Gym in Mexico City has already been changed since everyone was afraid of problems in the ring should Connect and Conan work together, so it's an all-AAA main with Santo and Octagon, and La Parca and Latin Lover versus Conan and Eddie Guerrero and Fuerza Guerrera and Heavy Metal, plus Villanos versus Dinamitas, Payasos versus Transformer and Tinieblas Jr. and Lizmark and Mascarada Sagrada and Octagon Cheeto and Super Muñequito versus Espectrito Cyan and 2 in the La Parquita. Espectrito 2 is the younger brother of Espectrito, who was the original Fuercita Guerrera, not the latest one who is very good but the one from last year who was pretty bad. This card won't be taped for television since they have such a backlog of shows from December that have yet to air. Word I get now is the When Worlds Collide and Hiroshima shows will air in Mexico City on January 8th. The magazine California's television lists Volver a Empezar as the worst soap opera on television. This show airs on prime time on Univision throughout the US. Reason I bring this up is because that's the soap, which is also either the number 1 or number 2 soap in Mexico, that Conan appears on frequently. La Sirenita, who holds the Mexican women's title, is jumping here from MLL, and Pena is talking about bringing in a wrestler from Japan for her to feud with. Lizmark Jr., who is one of the most promising young wrestlers in the world, broke his leg, femur bone, in 2 places on December 29th until Tepig doing a tope on Fishman and landing wrong and will be out of action for 3 months. He underwent surgery over the weekend. Lolo Gonzalez is working on a deal to get all the women from UWA, EMLL and AAA to work together as a women's promotion and book themselves across promotional lines to give all the women new faces to work with. Apparently Pena told her if she could pull it off that he'd give all the women television exposure. Shinjiro Otani's debut has been delayed because things just didn't get done on time due to the office being closed for the holidays, as opposed to the usual things just not getting done on time. 2 of the best matches on US television all year aired on the December 24th and December 31st Galavision shows. One was the complete Blue Panther vs. Mariachi Mexican middleweight title match. Highlights had aired previously that had been reported in Mexico as being the best match in years. Match was 3 falls lasting 27-22 with Panther winning via submission in the third. It's the kind of match that some people would love, particularly fans of 70s style, and others wouldn't like because it was all mat work, but it was the best mat work match in years. Very little brawling, just a little flying, no hot flying moves except for 2 standards topes in the third fall. The heel worked totally face style and was heavily cheered and face was booed, but the match was a total wrestling clinic. Then after the match seconds, Jerry Estrada and Stuka started brawling with Panther, helping Estrada bringing Pantrita Del Ring, who hadn't been seen in months, in for a run-in to make the save, 4.5 stars. They also had an excellent 8-man tag with Conan Love Machine Madonna's boyfriend King Lion vs. Santo Aguayo, Lizmark Latin on the December 31st show. As good in a totally different way was the Love Machine and Guerrero vs. Conan and Madonna's boyfriend match that aired on December 24th Galavision. Guerrero in particular was unbelievable in this match, although I'd rate it a tad behind the When Worlds Collide match, 4.5 stars. Galavision show continues to be half AAA and half MLL, which will take a major edge off AAA when they run house shows in the US in 1995 unless they get their own television elsewhere or that changes. On the other hand, the devaluation of the peso makes running successful US shows that much more important this year for AAA and possibly MLL, which is apparently looking to use its new Galavision exposure as a springboard, although as shows in Houston and Los Angeles this past year have shown, it's not going to cut it. The peso fell 43% compared to the dollar from December 20th to January 2nd, which means the same amount of money at the gate in dollars means 43% more pesos at home. This also gives US promoters added leverage in bargaining for shows. For the few fans who attend matches in Mexico, ticket prices will drop sizably. For example, ringside at Tijuana for AAA in dollars goes from $17 to $10. The losers are the foreign wrestlers who work in Mexico whose pay suddenly decreased by 43% in 2 weeks unless they are able to get their money renegotiated, and the Mexican promotions who want to import new foreign stars because it'll cost them that much more as a percentage of what they're bringing in at the gate to pay them in dollar or yen equivalents. WCW. Hulk Hogan's drawing power continued because even with weak lineups, WCW drew its two largest non-pay-per-view gates of the year on December 28 in Minneapolis, almost 4,000 paying $63,000, and December 29 in Chicago, 4,400 paying $74,000, for Hogan and Sting vs. Avalanche and Butcher, with the predictable ending both nights. The attendance numbers are approximate paid. Both shows had considerably more in the building because of liberal freebies. With those two dates combined with Nashville on December 27, officially 6,400 paying $82,000, which is a great house considering in 1989 when they did the Flair Steamboat Music City Showdown pay-per-view in the same building, which was one of the better pay-per-view shows of all time, they did about 4,000 paid and $37,000. It was the best three-day run for the company in years. The irony of all this was it came just days after the lowest-rated weekend on television in the history of wrestling on the Superstation, with WCW Saturday Night doing a 1.6. Main event of 1.1. The only time it ever got that low before was a few years back when we went head-to-head with the Super Bowl, and Pro at 1.4. Now that is explainable to a point because Christmas weekend always does terrible. Anyway, the continued low ratings and poor quality of television will only serve to speed up the Ric Flair return, because now everyone is convinced it's a necessary move, just there is no consensus on how it should be done. If nothing else, Flair's presence should at least pick up the television show, because his weekly interviews will become the highlight of the show based on the quality of everything else of late. WCW bought a half-page ad on page 2 of the Sports in USA Today before Starrcade. In another mistake that only could happen here, on the television show that aired over the weekend in Las Vegas plugging the January 25 Clash, the phone number given for tickets was of the Hampton, Virginia Coliseum. About 1,000 of the 4,000 seats are sold with 3 weeks to go, but they are almost all expensive, $50 seats, so it's nearly $40,000 in already. The Cruiserweight tournament has been delayed for a while because nobody has gotten their act together as far as bringing in outside talent. With Eric Bischoff in Japan this week for the Tokyo Dome, it's expected he'll request 1 or 2 wrestlers like Shinjiro Otani and Chris Benoit. They have a verbal deal with Antonio Pena to send in 2 wrestlers. Pena is looking to send in Jerry Estrada and Eddie Guerrero, although I've heard Bischoff didn't want Guerrero. Hogan has a meeting this week to discuss a revival of Thunder in Paradise with a new name of Thunder Force, in which a 4-person team of Hogan, Sting, Mr. T and a women martial artist would all be equal co-stars. Supposedly WCW's losses this year are cut to $3.5 million as opposed to the $5 to $6 million of previous years, but that the figure is misleading because Hogan's salary comes from the Turner Home Entertainment ledger rather than the WCW ledger, and Hogan, between salary and bonuses and percentages, could be no less than $2.7 million and probably considerably higher for his 6 months, so the real losses are the highest ever. Because of this, there is considerable pressure to cut losses by knocking about $500,000 off the payroll, and you can imagine the internal fighting over whose friend's paycheck gets nailed. The Honky Tonk Man deal was that he refused to do a job for Johnny B. Bad as asked at Starrcade. According to one source, he would have done it had he received a contract and WCW was willing to offer him one, but the two sides were about $50,000 apart on a price tag. It looks as though Arnold Anderson will be replacing him against Johnny B. Bad at the Clash. Bunkhouse Buck worked as his replacement on the house shows this week. WCW got the WWF's television in St. Louis, so WWF has lost another formerly major market. The latest on Jean-Paul Levesque is that he's strongly considering going to Titan. He was promised by tag title with Steve Regal, with Sherry Martel being their manager, and I guess a feud with the babyface Harlem Heat. The Titan lore is that they've created numerous stars out of nobodies, which is something WCW has never been able to do even with somebodies. WWF. After the Holiday Wish Tour has largely flopped during the season that wrestling traditionally draws its biggest crowd, fingers are being pointed everywhere internally, particularly back and forth between house show promoters and the promotions department and the booking department. The California Swing, while a disappointment because of the time of the year being prime time for drawing, wasn't really as much of a disaster as it appears at first glance. First off, Sacramento was a good crowd and San Diego a fair crowd, considering the latter has never been a good city for wrestling. The Los Angeles Forum poor crowd was because of the same mistake they had made in the New York market of running 2 shows in the same market. They ran Anaheim 2 days later, and the combined Anaheim and Los Angeles crowd would have been a $135,000 house, which is impressive at any time, off the same television with the same lineups. San Francisco was nearly a disaster, 3,000 in the building but only 1,600 paid, but that can also be explained about running at 14,500 seat arena in a market with no syndicated television. In addition, even though I pretty much grew up watching wrestling at the Cow Palace, It is time to retire running at that arena because with modern buildings in San Jose and Sacramento and Oakland being semi-modern, the Cow Palace is now comparatively a dump. It was about 40 degrees in the building, and you can imagine how enthused that made the wrestlers about taking bumps, which, combined with the last night of the tour and wanting to get home for New Year's Eve, equaled a terrible work rate. The new structure at the top is Vince McMahon is remaining as booker. However, Pat Patterson has been moved laterally, and he and Bruce Pritchard are in charge of writing the television, and Jim Ross will be McMahon's assistant. There have been tons of rumors regarding why Ross is being brought in, with most of the belief that they want a more serious and less slapstick product, with a lot of people saying more Japan-like booking with winners and losers and more parity at the top among 10 guys, rather than building around 4 Superman faces as they did last year. The only problem is to do Japan style and make it work. You need an audience educated to it as sport rather than ice capades, which they don't have, and you need wrestlers who can perform the style, which only a few can. You also need a schedule that would allow the wrestlers to perform it at the house shows, which with the current schedule, maybe a Ric Flair in his prime could have handled it and done great matches every night, but few normal human beings could, particularly if they have to pass drug tests regularly. It's a real catch-22 right now. Ross will also do some television show producing and set up a full-time 900 line, but the only announcing he'll do is to continue doing the SMW television, at least for the time being. Diesel missed shows in Anaheim and San Francisco because his mother died and was replaced by Razor Ramon, who they pulled from the B-town out east to work the A-cities against Bob Backlund on top. At least in San Francisco, Titan did a great job when it comes to a last-minute change. The marquee outside the building listed Ramon on top, and there were signs everywhere in front of the building and at the box office saying Ramon would wrestle Backlund on top and Diesel wouldn't appear, and they also announced that at the beginning of the show as well. There's already a lot of talk from within the company that Diesel isn't the answer, and the idea of going with Backlund on top was a fiasco blamed on Patterson. I don't know if they'll do a change to Hart or Michaels. My feeling is they've got WrestleMania plans locked in, whatever they are. Whatever changes in direction will be made really won't go into effect until the new season in late April. At the house shows this week they had Michaels doing Live Heartbreak Hotels. Believe it or not, they weren't any good, where he pushed the idea of him winning the title at Mania, which seems awfully early to push something like that, particularly since they don't want to be giving stuff away. It is beginning to look like Hart may wind up like Flair as a 10-time champion, because he'll constantly be replaced and shoved aside for the latest new monster, and as soon as his successor can't hang once put in the spotlight, they go back to the solid guy. Monday Night Raw on December 26th did a 2.2 rating, Smith vs. Tatanka, while Mania did a 1.1. Action Zone was preempted last week. Again, because of Christmas week, those low numbers shouldn't be taken that seriously. Raw will be live on January 9th from the Summit in Houston as the second-year anniversary show, with Ramon vs. Owen Hart for the IC title and a tuxedo match with Howard Finkel vs. Harvey Whippleman. Upcoming television shoots are January 23rd in Palmetto, Florida, Live Raw January 24th in West Palm Beach and January 25th in Fort Myers, Florida, February 20th in Marietta, Georgia, Live Raw, February 21st in Augusta, Georgia, and February 22nd in North Charleston, South Carolina, and March 13th in Stockton Civic Auditorium, Live Raw, March 14th in Fresno and March 15th in San Jose, the San Jose State building that AAA used. We were incorrect last week listing March 13th in Sacramento. At least as it's planned now, that show, since it'll be a live Raw out east, is scheduled for a 5:30 p.m. start on a Monday, although it is only a 2,000-seat building and they will have all the big stars there. Doing TV in San Jose, challenge no less, is kind of a surprise because they have no television in the market, are running the secondary building, and the last show in the primary building only did 3,200. Manny Garcia, who is the guy at the A shows who gives away the merchandise, will be replacing Finkel as the ring announcer at the Raw shots. February will be a weak month as far as house shows, as they only have 5 B shows booked and most of the A shows are in secondary markets. Only major market shows are February 3rd in Montreal, February 4th in Boston, February 10th in Pittsburgh, February 12th in Philadelphia, February 19th in Auburn Hills, Michigan, and February 24th in Chicago. I believe Diesel vs. Shawn Michaels headlines, which would be curious since if that was going to be the main event at Mania, you'd think they'd save it. Most expect Backlund to be moved from the top quickly, but not until he puts Bret Hart over in rematches. Notes from the December 30th Cow Palace show. 1. Smoking Guns beat Heavenly Bodies in 10-12 when Billy pinned Del Rey with a backslide. Decent opener, but the finish was a disaster. Somehow Billy didn't bridge, or his bridge collapsed with Del Rey on his back and he never pulled Del Rey over. Actually, it was the ref's fault. Knowing it was the finish, he started counting with Del Rey caught on Billy's back. Just a total embarrassment of a finish. 1 1/2 star. 2. Wink and Pink beat Queasy and Sleazy in 7:49. It served its purpose. At about the point the comedy started dragging, they went home. Watching a match like this after seeing Triple A does make one seem like they are being transported back to the 70s. 1/4 star, 3. Bigelow pinned Bomb with his feet on the ropes in 7:50. 1 1/4 stars, 4. Luger Kurt Tatanka in 8:54. Actually, as a match this was negative stars. Luger punched like a girl early, and after he got done with those, the match went to a bear hug with no heat until the dead Kerr finish. However, the post-match had a lot of heat, with Luger calling Tatanka back in and putting him in the torture rack. After the match they continued to brawl. The post-match was the most heated stuff on the show. 3/4 star, 5. Aldo Montoya pinned Brooklyn Brawler in 4:43 with a bulldog off the top. Just about every spot in the match was mistimed, although Brawler is the wrong opponent for a guy trying to get over as a young flyer. 1 star, 6. Ramon pinned Backlund to keep the IC title in 6:27 with a sunset flip. Ramon was the most over wrestler on the show, but Backlund killed his heat once the bell rang. Shawn Michaels, who was at ringside, had to carry the heat for the entire match because nothing happened in the ring. Fred Blassie was the guest ring announcer for this match. To a polite reaction, Blassie worked here in the 60s but was a big star in Southern California and not in SF, as when you're down to 1,600 paid, it's the longtime fans and they knew who he was. Michaels took great bumps as a second to keep the match out of negative stars. 1 star, 7. Davey Boy Smith pinned Jim Neidhart with a schoolboy in 8:23. All Reese holds. 2 stars, 8. Undertaker pinned IRS in 7:39 with the tombstone. Good ring entrance, although minus a lot of the usual special effects. Match had little heat, and was typical Undertaker. Only reaction was to his sitting up after moves. 1/2 star. Expect to get a sizable push with the idea of creating a black superstar. The reader's pages. I'm looking for a videotape of the Conan Pero Aguayo match from a few years back at Arena Mexico where Aguayo won and Conan unmasked. Jack Catalano of 680 Forest Road, Northford, Connecticut 06472 is looking for newsletters to subscribe to and tapes of ECW, USWA, SMW and other major events. Stacey McMacken of P.O. Box 170, Naperville, Illinois 60563 is looking for photos or videos of Trevor Blanchard, SMW videotapes and looking to get in touch with Observer readers in the Chicago area. Chris McCormick of 1217 January 2nd Kinsmore Avenue, Fort Wayne, Indiana 46807 is looking for FMW, New Japan, All Japan, ECW, SMW and USWA tapes. Bill Donna of Road 2 Box 480, Brockway, Pennsylvania 15824 is looking for tapes of Maple Leaf Wrestling. Otto wants CWA tapes, 1993-94 Tough Man pay-per-view shows and 43 Phantom serial. Derek Ambergy of P.O. Box 777, Monroe, Washington 98272 is looking for old newsletters, particularly Observers and Torch. Matt Marketplace of P.O. Box 2371, Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts 02130 has Japanese wrestling dolls for sale. Mike Motley of P.O. Box 691482, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74169 is looking for raw footage from California. Ricky Short of Route 2 Box 297, Gretna, Virginia 24557 is looking for the September 3, 1994 issue of Pro Wrestling Torch. Wrestling Institute News Magazine is a monthly 32-page newspaper on U.S. amateur wrestling. If you are interested in amateur wrestling, this is an excellent publication. Subscriptions are $24.95 per year at P.O. Box 503, Dixon, Illinois 61021. Cornell Brennan of P.O. Box 642, Hammond, Indiana 46325 is looking for into and photos of Al Massey, Jack Wentworth and other NWA wrestlers that worked Atlanta in the mid-40s to mid-50s. He is also looking to buy photos of wrestlers from that time period. Scott Teal of P.O. Box 2781, Hendersonville, Tennessee 370772781 has sample back issues of his newsletter Whatever Happened To? For $1 per issue. Danny DeAngelo of 1252 N. Clara Avenue, DeLand, Florida 32720 is interested in trading his collection of magazines for videos. Robert Holcomb of 1814 Arrowhead, Godfrey, Illinois 62035 is looking for All Japan Women 89 present, UWFI and Japanese UFC. Jay Kappas of Box 500, Scott AFB, Illinois 62225 is looking for AAA television, Triple Manias, All Japan and New Japan TV, AJW Tokyo Dome, SMW major shows and pre-86 American Wrestling Alliance. He is Midwest Indies, AAA, American Wrestling Alliance, SMW and LPPVs to trade. Mark Underwood of 186 Harding Road, Yuba City, California 959935126 is looking for the 1015 All Japan TV show, 1015 and 1022 New Japan and 1031 All Japan Women shows. Don Hernandez of 345 EN Melrose, Dr. Vista, California 92803, who claims to be the world's largest referee with 18 years experience, is looking for dates. David Krause of 36889 S Lakeshore BL, Eastlake, Ohio 44095 is looking for Paducah, Kentucky TV, Midwest Pro Wrestling and California Independence. Sandy Krebs' letter. Reading Sandy Krebs' letter in The Observer, one thought came to mind. 1994 was the year that wasn't. We finally got Hogan vs. Flair to determine who was really better all those years. The feud took place in WCW but ended up as the final, no turning back admission by WCW that WCW and NWA were always the minor league. Never mind that Hogan is WCW champion, he will always be thought of as a WWF wrestler. When you mention Hogan to people, they immediately think of WWF. There is no reason to correct them. WCW is just a wannabe WWF. Hogan is the greatest. Flair's a footnote. In WCW. Everyone else who ever wrestled for WCW is a second-rate wrestler by WCW's own admission. So what's the point in watching WCW? Vince McMahon should sue WCW for blatantly stealing his best idea. Bob Backlund was pulled from the reject pile right to the top. When I was a kid, Backlund was my hero. Like him or not, he had an air of legitimacy to him. It was the same thing that kept Harley Race, Nick Bockwinkel and Vern Gagne on top for so long. But now I watch him and I shake my head. I was glad to see the heel turn. I thought maybe we'd see the Backlund of old. Can Bob Backlund really be that bad? Is he so bad now? Or was he always that bad? And if he is and was, why did the WWF waste both his and our time? 1994 promised matches and events people had waited for a long time to see. Yet, as the year drew to a close, it felt like we had been cheated. Hopefully in 1995 pro wrestling will get both a new number one and a new generation. We didn't get either in 1994. 1994 was just the year that stripped away that last vestiges of the past. Mark Hahn. Sun Valley, California. I must agree with Sandy Krebs' letter that pro wrestling right now is just plain boring. On the surface, the Hogan defection, the McMahon trial and Diesel leading the WWF into 1995 seems all to be big news. But none of it has gotten people to watch television. Besides ECW, the only thing that was interesting was Monday Night Raw, and that seems to have lost its steam. I'm not a big advocate of work rate, but if a match is going to be intriguing because of storyline, then the promotions need to take a new direction to get people compelled to go to the arenas. There needs to be angles that shock people and get them excited again. Remember when Dusty Rhodes had no partner to face Ole Anderson and J.J. Dillon in the cage and it turned out to be Nikita Koloff? Fans were in amazement because this dreaded heel was aiding the top babyface. Could you see Savage and Butcher working over Hogan and having Hogan surprisingly come to the ring with Vader as his partner? At this point, that is an example of the type of shock people need. If WWF were to run a tournament on Monday Night Raw for a junior heavyweight title using 1-2-3 Kid and guys from New Japan, they'd create interest in a new title. I think it's inevitable Titan has to start pushing work rate because the gimmicks don't draw. Undertaker was the exception. It was a success. But they aren't going to have a lot of future success building around gimmicks because people want to see substance. The only gimmick that has a chance is work rate, and there aren't more than 5 WWF wrestlers that have that. 3 was a time when I could watch WCW, but now I just don't bother. Sometimes it's tough to do the radio show because of how poor the business is. It's a hard fact to swallow, but it's too hard to cover it up. I love pro wrestling, but if 1995 is anything like 1994, Eric Bischoff needs to be looking for a new job and Vince McMahon had better be prepared to see his syndicated network drop below 100. Actually, the best gimmick for Vince McMahon is to create a Scott Bakula-type character right out of Quantum Leap and take him back to the 80s where his promotion belongs. Oops, that's too late. Bischoff already beat him to the idea. My top 10 matches of 1994: 1. Shawn Michaels vs. Razor Ramon ladder match. 2. Pegasus vs. Sasuke J-Cup final. 3. Kobashi vs. Williams Budokan. 4. Machine and Guerrero vs. Santo and Octagon when worlds collide. 5. Liger vs. Sasuke J-Cup. 6. Brett vs. Owen SummerSlam cage match. 7. Nasty Boys vs. Cactus Jack and Kevin Sullivan Spring Stampede. 8. Diesel and Michaels vs. 1-2-3 Kid and Ramon. 9. Masawa and Kobashi vs. Tao and Kawada May 21st. 10. Hogan vs. Flair Bash at the Beach. Vinnie Carolyn. Stoughton, Massachusetts. Art Barr. I couldn't believe the letter written by Robert Temple regarding your coverage of the death of Art Barr. First of all, that has to rank among the 5 best issues of the Observer ever. Second, if he thinks AAA is a minor league promotion or that Art Barr was a minor league wrestler, he should stick to reading After magazines. I'm a hardcore fan and a fan of the WWF when they present a good product. That actually gets me heat from some hardcore fans, but they know I'm an avid follower of ECW, AAA and Japan. I don't know of many hardcore fans in this area who will admit to caring about the WWF or the Hogan and Friends Federation. Starrcade 94 is the first pay-per-view in the last 8 years that I didn't order. Regarding Bob Backlund. I was at the Garden the night he lost the title. I can't remember seeing as much true heel heat for a WWF performer in recent years. When Backlund walked out with the title belt after the first match on the show and stood silently in the ring for 3 to 5 minutes without saying a word, the reaction was amazing. He provoked the crowd into a frenzy before even getting on the mic and delivering his morality speech. Backlund will place high in my voting for best heel, but not ahead of Love Machine, who gets first place. Paul Sosnowski. Perth Amboy, New Jersey. I take exception with the letter written by Robert Temple which states you should stick to what people care about, WWF and WCW. What a completely geocentric point of view. First, your readers are not representative of the masses who only know what they are exposed to. That's precisely why people like me subscribe to newsletters. Second, I think it's safe to say that the unexpected death of Art Barr, one of the world's most talented workers, is a bigger story than a WWF title change. Third, referring to AAA as minor league is simply wrong. Their attendance in the United States eclipses that of WCW and rivals WWF. Furthermore, in terms of product, AAA is far superior to WWF and especially WCW. Finally, if Mr. Temple is primarily interested in WWF and WCW, perhaps he should stick to After magazines, which concentrate on those 2 groups, ignore anything foreign or new in their own angles and BS ratings. Based on the awards balloting and letters pages, I conclude the people reading The Observer are far more wanting of news and promotions that receive less exposure in the United States, such as ECW, SMW and foreign promotions. Your publication provides a balanced look at all of pro wrestling as far as I'm concerned. Harley York. Garnerville, New York. DM. Based on hundreds of awards ballots, there are many readers who primarily or even only follow WWF and WCW. However, it appears the vast majority are interested in numerous different organizations. Besides, this publication has always been international in scope, its readership is international in nearly 24 countries, and the United States is a major country when it comes to wrestling, but it isn't the entire world. There is much to be learned from successful organizations, and even unsuccessful organizations all over the world, and the style they choose, and from their new more creative stars. Based on any standards you wish to judge, with the exception of internal organization, AAA is not minor league either in this country or on a worldwide basis. With about a month's perspective on the 2 stories, the WWF title change to Diesel and the death of Art Barr, I'm convinced that as far as overall importance to pro wrestling, that issue in regard to amount of coverage and placement of coverage of the 2 stories was more than fair. It had far more impact overall in wrestling, both short-term and even more long-term. In some ways, Barr was the top heel draw in the world in 1994. He was the main event heel on more shows that drew in excess of 10,000 fans last year than any wrestler in the world. More importantly, his potential was even stronger than what he had already achieved, and he also had a very unique life which made everything tied together into that much more of a major story. Looking back, there was one story from that very newsworthy week that we totally underplayed, and it wasn't the WWF title change. It was the retirement of Rick Steamboat, who was a major name in the business for nearly 2 decades and one of the greatest wrestlers in the history of the industry. Our goal is to cover all major groups around the world, and you'll find more actual news from WWF and WCW here than in any other publication, just as you'll find more news from the major league foreign groups. AJW history. Some issues ago you wrote that Suzuka Minami and Yumiko Hata held the WWA tag team titles as the Marine Wolves in 1989 and 1990. Actually, the Marine Wolves were Minami and Akira Hokuto. At that time, Hata teamed with Mitsuko Nishiwaki as the Fire Jets. The Fire Jets held the tag team title in 1988, winning from Bull Nakano and Grizzly Owamoto, but lost the belts to Yumi Ogura and Mika Komatsu. The Crush Girls defeated Ogura and Komatsu in 1989 but vacated the belts when Asuka retired. The Marine Wolves won the vacant championships but lost them to the Fire Jets in 1989. Asia Kong and Iwamoto beat the Fire Jets for the titles in 1989, and the Marine Wolves beat Kong and Iwamoto for the titles in 1990. Just to complicate the issue, Hara held the titles with Hokuto, when Hokuto worked under his real name of Hisako Uno in 1987. Kirk Beattie. Toongabbie, Australia. Hogan. I had an interesting conversation with Terry Bollea about you a few weeks ago. He comes into my video store. I mentioned that Lenny Poffo and Brian Knobbs come in also. I asked him if he's signed a new deal since his original one was up in December. He asked me how I knew and if that big mouth Knobbs had told me. I told him I was an Observer reader. He said that he couldn't believe how someone who had never taken a bump in his life could make such a living in the wrestling business. I wanted to ask him the same thing. Len Thomas. Largo, Florida. When I last renewed, I made some favorable comments about WCW and the return of Hulk Hogan. Some of my friends questioned my sanity at that time for those comments. But at the time I never dreamed WCW would become an Hogan and his hangers-on federation. They have ignored every bit of real talent in the company to the point I can't even bear to watch the television, even though worldwide is finally available locally. The future of wrestling in North America is very clear. AAA. I eagerly await if their television comes here in either English or Spanish. The upcoming 500-channel cable deluge will surely bring us many more hours of different pro wrestling, and hopefully AAA will become a part of it. I enjoyed your piece on Art Barr very much. You did a tremendous job of summarizing the contradictions his life involved. Lonnie McLeod. New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. DM. Well, I think the style of work in AAA may be the wrestling of the future in North America and is certainly more futuristic than either the WWF or WCW style. I just don't know if AAA has the connections and the promotional power in the United States to take full advantage of its in-ring strengths and ever be the top promotion or even a top promotion in the United States and Canada. Through pay-per-view, if they execute things correctly, they can be a successful part of the scene, but right now they aren't in a position to do those things correctly. Even if they did, they would then have a huge battle that would be difficult to overcome, and that is competing against something that I don't want to call racism because that isn't quite the correct term, but is something similar to racism. WCW. As a longtime wrestling fan who has a deep love for the business and can watch any promotion's television show, watching WCW television has become almost impossible. I say this not at all taking into consideration the in-ring talent. What insults and angers me is that the wrestling no longer has any meaning. All the television has become is an infomercial. Rarely do the announcers talk about the matches. They plug the 900 line, pay-per-view shows, clashes, Hogan merchandise, their merchandise, 900 line. The wrestling is meant as nothing but material for Bobby Heenan and Gene Okerlund to make jokes of to get themselves over and kill the product. Anyone who knocks WWF for whatever reason and praises WCW had better realize that WCW only does the same thing worse. Don Label. Ilion, New York. Was it Ric Flair's decision to retire from WCW, or did WCW think that it would be more profitable for Hulk Hogan to carry the company? If WCW thought it would be more profitable to have Hogan as champion, then why couldn't Flair have stayed as a wrestler underneath? After Flair carried NWA and WCW for more than 10 years, why did it have to end up like this? Hulk Hogan hasn't changed his boring act in 10 years. Nobody cared about him the last time he went back to the WWF. He is booed at the WCW Monday and Tuesday television tapings I attend. The cheering sounds are edited in over the actual boos. If the fans don't want Hogan in either federation, doesn't WCW realize they've made an error of extreme magnitude in keeping him? WCW handled the Flair-Hogan scenario totally wrong. Having Sherry Martel there cheapened the matches. The promotion has since become almost circus-like. WCW has really blown it this time. I know Ric Flair isn't the future of pro wrestling, but he has contributed much to wrestling's past. Don't you think he deserved better than this? Will we ever see Flair wrestle again? Jim Ferris. Haleyville, Alabama. DM. It was WCW management's decision to retire Flair temporarily because they were desperate for a big buy rate for Halloween Havoc, which didn't materialize, possibly because Hogan not losing at the August Clash killed a lot of the heat in the feud, to make their 1994 final ledger not look so bad. WCW management for the most part never truly wanted to retire Flair, they just wanted a buy rate and have Flair sell the retirement as a short-term gimmick. There were those who wanted Flair out of the ring permanently aside from a gimmick comeback because of the belief his being around somehow held down the younger wrestlers, or in some circles because of the belief that as long as Flair was around, Hogan would never be truly accepted as a babyface in some parts of the country. Even though Hogan isn't nearly as popular with the week-to-week wrestling television viewers as the television illusion makes him look, he has tremendous name value to the general public that doesn't follow wrestling that can't be ignored. His name means far more when it comes to selling tickets to non-fans for an occasional house show, selling PPVs to non-fans and merchandise than anyone else in wrestling by a wide margin, even if the week in and week out wrestling fans don't care for him. Of course, his paycheck is also more by a wide margin than anyone else in wrestling. Whether WCW is better off with him than without him is debatable, but they're going to stick with him, for better or for worse, for at least the next 2 years. I agree WCW handled Flair Hogan all wrong, but that's part of the price of doing business with Hogan, that he was never going to allow Flair to look good for whatever ego or business reasons he has. Does Flair deserve better? I think Flair's fans deserve better, but wrestling promoters for the most part don't care about their fans. There are exceptions, but not in the WCW hierarchy, obviously. But Flair got himself a great deal to do the job for Hogan, and I'm sure he'll be back in the ring by the late spring. So the only thing when it comes to Flair himself that I feel bad about is the way management sprung the retirement angle on him, considering all he's meant to the company. And in that sense, he deserved more consideration. Aside from that, I can't say Flair himself got the shaft, because if his final match at Havoc was a circus rather than what his legacy deserved, and if they didn't do a tribute to him at the end of the show, the fact was he was part of that decision-making process, and I'm sure if he, in exchange for doing the job, would have demanded something different, that's what would have happened. But I do feel sorry for Flair fans that Flair didn't stick up for what his career deserved. I'm a new subscriber, but have noticed a constant theme on the letters page. That is readers having high expectations of American promotions, in particular WWF and WCW, which they never reach, nor are they likely to. In my country, live wrestling shows are non-existent, and we are lucky to get 1 hour of WCW worldwide on television. Be thankful for what you have, because you will miss it if it isn't there. Enjoy all forms of pro wrestling. E. Allison. Valley Heights, New South Wales, Australia. That's it for this issue, wrestling fans. Until next time, Wrestle Machine, out.